I'm going to talk to you today about the changes that have occurred in the nomination process and how these changes have affected the party, how these changes have affected the candidates, and how these changes affect a democratic electoral process. Now, we've seen, I think, three major changes this time around in the way we select a president. Because of complaints by a number of states that they got to hold their primary or caucus after the nominee had been effectively determined, the Democratic Party 2 years ago passed a rule which said, in effect, that after Iowa there'd be Nevada, and after New Hampshire there would be South Carolina, and that way a better cross-section of Democratic partisans resembling the party's electoral coalition would be able to participate. Well, according to the Democratic rules, the first time any other state could hold their primary or caucus was February 5th, and many states have moved their election up, including a lot of the big states. So today, we have a super-duper Tuesday on February 5th, when more than 60% of the candidates for both parties will have been selected. Now, the problem with this, there are good and bad features of this. The good features are we'll probably increase the level of participation, and that's good for a democratic society. Another good feature of moving things up is that more people will be able to have a say in who their party's candidates are, and that candidate probably will better reflect the rank and file of the party. In other words, representation will be improved. But the negatives of this are basically threefold. Number one, some states, such as yours, have decided not to play by the rules. So you're going to have a primary that none of the candidates are coming to, and none of the delegates who are selected for the Democrats will be able to vote at the Democratic convention, and only half the Republican delegates will be able to vote at the Republican convention. But it also shows the fact that the parties do not control their state affiliates, and it shows the weakness of the parties at the national level. Michigan has threatened to do the same thing, although I think in the end Michigan is going to back off. The second problem is that if you have to run in all the big states on the same day, you need a lot of money. And this nomination process is going to cost the leading candidates $100 million. So far, by the end of September 30th, Mrs. Clinton and Barack Obama had raised about three-quarters of that. Obama had raised $76 million. And Mrs. Clinton had raised about 67 or 68 million, but she also transferred 11 million from her Senate campaign when she ran in 2006 against essentially a nobody candidate. And so they're in the best positions. They have the most money on hand. The problem of moving everything towards the beginning is that there doesn't seem to be an effective way for the lesser-known candidates to establish their credibility as candidates and then use that to run effectively for their party's nomination. In 1976, Jimmy Carter was able to do better than expected in Iowa and New Hampshire, win Florida against George Wallace, and use that as a vehicle for raising more money and effectively getting the Democratic nomination in 1976. That's much, much harder to do today, even though some of the candidate strategies, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, are premised on doing exactly that. And the only reason they have that strategy is that there is no other effective strategy that they can use. If you can't raise the big bucks, then raising big bucks is important for three reasons. One, it gives you flexibility. Number two, it attracts media coverage. In the year before the primary, the media used the amount of money raised as a barometer of electability. And so the leading candidates who raise the most get the most coverage. And if you get the most coverage, that way the public views you as more likely to be elected. And if you're viewed as more likely to be elected, you'll get more money because most people don't like to bank money on a loser. So it's one thing that works on the other. So the money situation is extremely important. The other thing about front-loading is not only does it raise the importance of money, and not only does it cause divisions within the party, but the third aspect of front-loading is that there are two scenarios. One, that by February 5th, the leading candidates will be evident in both parties. And so the tension, the competition, will go out of the nomination. And if the competition fades, the media coverage fades. The candidates then spend an inordinate amount of time raising more money for the general election. And how do you keep the public interested and involved? And remember, the parties have moved their conventions to the very end of the summer. The Democrats are going to hold their convention the last week in August, and the Republicans are going to hold their convention the first week in September. So you'll have 6 months where you really have to keep the public involved, energize your base, repair your damaged image or whatever else has gone on. And that's not a very effective way to run a democratic electoral process. So party rules and front-loading is one major change, and that change has probably hurt the parties, and it may have in the short run promoted greater turnout, which makes it more democratic, but it may have improved the representational character of the nominees, but it hasn't done much else. The second big change this time around is that public funding seems to be marginalized and almost dead. Now, the public funding, which began with laws passed during the Nixon administration, he opposed these laws, incidentally. So how did the Democrats prevent him from vetoing them, as President Bush is vetoing legislation today? They bought him out. What they said was, if you'll sign this, we'll make it not applicable for 72 when you're eligible to run for re-election. We'll make it applicable to 76 when you can't run. And Nixon didn't give a damn what happened after he couldn't run, so he signed off on the legislation. Now, there have been a lot of, I can go into this in great detail, I do in the books, but the fact of the matter is, today, we have a provision for public funding, and that provision was designed, number one, to even the playing field, number two, to bring the contributors out into the open so we know who is giving money to whom and how much, number three, to limit the amount of money you could give, and number four was to provide the opportunity for the candidates to receive matching grants in the primaries and full funding in the general election so they could spend more time campaigning and less time fundraising. And those were laudable goals, I think. All of them were. Well, you know, in the case of campaign finance, where there's a will, there's a way. And the law went into effect in 1976. And then in that election, turnout declined, and we didn't see what we usually see in American elections, a lot of bumper stickers and a lot of buttons and campaign paraphernalia. And the Congress said, this is awful. all they're spending their money on is advertising. Let's allow the parties to build their base, and let's give them the opportunity to raise unsolicited and initially even unreported amounts of money in efforts to get people out to vote. This was the so-called soft money provision. And not much happened in the 80s to change things, but in the 90s, President Clinton, particularly in 1996, used this provision to raise a lot of money for the Democrats and for his own re-election campaign so that he could change his public image and move from being considered a liberal Democrat to a born-again moderate. And it worked for Clinton, and then it continued to work in subsequent elections. So in 2002, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act was passed under the support and sponsorship of Senator McCain and Senator Russ Feingold and Ernest Hollings. And this prevented the parties from raising soft money. To compensate the parties, the law doubled the amount you could give, which previous to that had been $1,000. So it became $2,000, and the contributions were set to the rate of inflation. So that number goes up, and this year you can give $2,300 per candidate per election. I'm sure most of you have already sent your checks in for $4,600 as wealthy students in Central Florida, and you're well aware of this, and you've had your significant others send in their checks, and maybe one or two have even been written by your dogs. But at any rate, more money has flown in, and the fact of the matter is now that candidates can raise a lot of money on their own. Now, why not accept public funds if the public's going to support it? Because there's a provision on accepting public funds, and that is you can only spend a certain amount per state and a limit, which would be about $75 million total for the nomination process. Not only that, but once you reach that limit, you can't raise and spend any more money till you're nominated by your party. So no one wants to be put in the position of winning the nomination in February and then having no money to spend for anything until the conventions at the end of August or the beginning of September. So in 2004, first Howard Dean, who had raised the most money, I'm talking about Howard Dean, and John Kerry both decided to forego public funding, and that enabled Kerry, after he was nominated by the Democrats, to raise approximately $150 million to equal what President Bush had raised for the Republicans. Now, money seems to have been a big issue, and it does seem to me likely that, at least on the Democratic side, the best funded candidates will be the likely nominees. On the Republican side, I'm not so sure, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But we still, and I might say that polls show there's no great public support for public funding. So the public complains about special interest politics and about lobbyists giving so much money to Mrs. Clinton and the like, and yet they're quite content to have American elections paid for by the wealthy rather than by themselves and by their taxpayer dollars. So, you complain about things, but on the other hand, you're not willing to foot the bill. Now, there have been two other changes in this nomination process that involve money, and one relates to that law that I mentioned, the McCain-Feingold Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. One provision of that act was that interest groups, we call them PACs or advocacy groups, were running ads presumably in support of their issue, whatever the heck it was, but they were putting the candidates in their ads in such a way that they were helping or hurting particular candidates. And so many people felt that this was unfair and that these groups were raising and spending a lot of money, which was not subject to this limit of contributions. And therefore, the law that was passed said in 30 days or less before the general election, 30 days or less before the primaries, and 60 days or less before the general election, you couldn't run ads that mentioned one of the candidates by name. Sure, you could say run a pro-life or a pro-choice ad, but you couldn't mention the candidates by name. Well, I think it was 2006, in that campaign, in the spring of 2006, President Bush's nominees for the appellate court judges in the Senate were being filibustered by the Democrats. And so a pro-life group in Wisconsin ran an ad that told the Senate not to filibuster these good people, and if the people in Wisconsin agreed with this ad, they should send a letter to their senators. And it mentioned their senators by name, Russ Feingold and Herbert Kohl. Now, Russ Feingold was running for re-election that year. So the Federal Election Commission sued this group that it violated the law by mentioning Senator Feingold's name, although it didn't mention his position or that he had filibustered or that he was pro-choice rather than pro-life. The Supreme Court held last December that unconstitutionally restricted the freedom of speech of this group, so that part of the law is probably not going to be enforced anymore, and that would allow interest groups with a lot of money to run ads that really help or hurt one candidate or another. And so that, the death of public funding. And the final thing was that we had in the last campaign a number of outside groups referred to as 527s or 501c groups. And those numbers relate to the code, the income tax code, which allows these groups to organize and spend money in election campaigns and allows them to receive contributions of unlimited amounts. We had these groups raise a lot of money, primarily for Democratic candidates. And the FEC, after the election, sued some of these groups because they didn't file as political groups. And they collected fines, of about $3 million. Well, the fact of the matter was that these groups raised well over $100 million. So they are probably still going to operate, and they have actually in one state, in South Carolina, for John McCain, who is the opponent of this type of thing. And he's asked them to cease and desist, but he's had to do that, and they haven't done that as yet. The other big thing about this election is the use of the Internet. All the candidates have sites. Most of the candidates, particularly McCain, have run ads on Google and Yahoo that when certain words come up, their advertisement comes up. Senator Obama raised in the first 3 months $10 million from the Internet. He's had over 500,000 people leave their addresses on the Internet, their web addresses, so they can be organized by Obama and brought out. Whether they will come out or not is another question. And just last week, Ron Paul raised $4.2 million in one day on the Internet. So the Internet is being used now as a very effective and cheap fundraising tool. It's gotten a fair number of donors, of small donors. However, when we look at the amount of money that's been raised by the candidates, only 21% of that money comes from people who've donated $200 or less. And I have the figures if you're interested in, but approximately 50% of the money comes from people who have what we call maxed out, given the maximum amount of money to the candidate. So the wealthy are still disproportionately giving the money this time around, and that really undercuts, I think, the spirit of the campaign finance bill. Okay, so now let's turn from the changes to what's going on right now. I mean, this is the first election since 1952 where an incumbent president or vice president has not run. This is the first election where the principal candidates, they have gender, racial, ethnic, or religious, or age characteristics that we have never elected. We've never elected a president who was 70 years of age or older when elected, which is McCain. We've never elected a Mormon as president, which is Romney. We've never elected a person who's been married 3 times, like Giuliani, and at the rate he's going, it may be 4 by the election. That's why I could never understand Giuliani being so opposed to that ad by MoveOn.org, because MoveOn certainly characterizes Giuliani. We've never elected a woman. We've never elected an African-American candidate. And so the pollsters have been interested in this, and they've been asking questions. Actually, Gallup has been asking questions since 1937 if your party nominated an otherwise qualified candidate who was blank, Catholic, Jewish, Protestant, atheist, Mormon, you know, all that thing, would you vote for that candidate? And very not surprisingly today, most people say yes, they would. 95% said they vote for a Catholic, 94% said they vote for an African American, 92% for a Jew, 88% for a woman, 87% for Hispanic, 72% for a Mormon, and 2/3 say they'd vote for a person who's been married 3 times. A person 72 years of age, a majority said they'd vote for them, and the only 2 categories people said they wouldn't vote for was a homosexual and an atheist. And of course, if you're a gay atheist, forget it. You're not going to get much public support. But those questions are ridiculous. Why are those questions ridiculous? What's wrong with that question? Would you vote for an otherwise qualified person who was this or that? Anybody? Do you think? What? Go on, say it.
No one must be seen as a bigot.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Because these questions are really, are you biased? Are you prejudiced? And the American people don't want to be viewed as prejudiced. That's not a good thing to be viewed as today. And people are smart enough to know the right answer. William Schneider, the pollster on CNN, once told me, the dirty little secret about polling, he said, is people give what they think is the correct answer. And the correct answer is, I'm not prejudiced, right? So we've had to ask the questions another way in order to find out, and there are 2 ways they've been asking those questions today, and I'll give you the responses in a moment just to illustrate. Is America ready for an otherwise qualified candidate nominated by their party who is? Or would your neighbors vote for? You know, I'm not prejudiced, but my neighbors, holy cow, you know, something like that. You get very different results from that. Let me just give you 2 from a Gallup poll asking the question 2 different ways. If your party nominated a Mormon for president, that is, a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you know, you always have to put enough information in the question that people can answer it based on the very low level of information which most people possess. The very bad news about the American electorate, this doesn't apply to students from Central Florida, but the very bad news about the American electorate is people don't have a lot of information. The very good news about the American electorate is lacking information has never stopped anyone from having an opinion. And in a democracy, the opinion counts. So what if your party nominated a Mormon for president, that is, a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints? Would you vote for that person if he or she were qualified for the job? Of registered voters, 66% said yes, 25% said no. Then they asked at a different point in the poll, do you think America is ready to elect a Mormon president or not? 34% said yes, 48% said no. Now, whether this shows that people are prejudiced, I don't know. What it does show is people perceive that people are prejudiced. And, we're not going to know how this is going to affect it, but my guess is that one of the problems that Romney has had getting into double digits with all the money he's spent, and we can note that in a moment, is because evangelic and fundamentalist Christians do have a problem, many of them, with voting for a person whose religion they regard as a heresy. So we'll have to see how that works out later on. So let's go through quickly money, media, and momentum, and then we'll look to the general election, and then I'll try to summarize it with a few general comments. Begin by saying Democrats are more enthusiastic about their candidates than Republicans are about theirs. One of the ways we tell this is that the Democrats have raised more money, $218.8 million, through September 30th of this year than the Republicans, who've raised $168.4 million. Secondly, we see that Democrats are, because they've raised more money, they have more advertising, and they've received more coverage than the Republicans, although some of that comes from the fact that they declared earlier. Not only have they received more coverage, but they've received better coverage than the Republicans. They've had 10% more favorable coverage and 10% less negative coverage than the Republicans. Most of the negative coverage comes from talk radio, and most of it's directed at Hillary Clinton. Thus far, there's been a lot of advertising on television. From January 1st to October 10th, guess how many ads have been run for the presidential contest? 28,725. That's a lot of ads, okay? But you guys haven't seen any of them, have you? No. And it's not because you don't watch television. I'm sure most of you are addicted to television. Now, it may be that you watch ESPN or softcore porn rather than the election stuff, and that's why you don't see it. I don't know. But the point is that 71% of these ads have been in Iowa, 71%. And all but 93% have been on local television. So you're not going to see them here. Now, you will see them in the general election because Florida is a pivotal state. You may see more of them if Giuliani runs against Clinton in some of the other pivotal states which normally go Democratic, because he's probably has a better chance in those states than typical Republicans have had. Now, the strategies that the candidates are using at this point... Oh, and let me say one other thing about the coverage. The amount of coverage has increased, but the type of coverage has not. 62% of the news stories on the campaign through October 10th have covered the race and the strategy of the candidates, the horse race, who's ahead, how the candidates are doing, what they need to do to get ahead. 15% have covered policy issues. So there is a heavy emphasis on the contest, as you know. We cover elections as if they were sporting events, and to maintain interest, because maintaining interest means you maintain the size of your audience. If you maintain the size of your audience, you can charge more for the advertising. We have a private sector that runs our media, and they're interested in making money, and it's very American. Okay, so where do we stand at this point? I know probably some of the other speakers have spoke to you about this. Mrs. Clinton has a large lead among Democrats, and the most significant part of this is that it is among every Democratic group, including African Americans. In African Americans, she receives 47% compared to 39% for Barack Obama. And so she has a deep lead. She's running pretty close to even in Iowa, way ahead in New Hampshire. And so, Obama and Edwards, as you know, in the last two debates have become more critical because her lead was expanding and they had to do something to try to become the ABC candidate, the anyone but Clinton candidate. Now, Edwards has put all his money in Iowa. He's going to accept public funds. He's got a couple of unions behind him. If he doesn't win or come in second in Iowa, I think he's finished. I don't think he goes anywhere. Obama has enough money to continue and to run in the big states. But Obama has to win somewhere. Has to demonstrate that he has something that Mrs. Clinton doesn't have. She's got more experience, and he's made a number of mistakes in this campaign, just false statements, and he's tired and he exaggerates a little bit, and that's a big thing. Remember, President Bush, before he was president, had the same problem, except his problem was a pronunciation problem. He had real problems with multi-syllable words after 9:30 at night. It was so... and the press played gotcha journalism with him, and every time he made a mistake it was on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post and the like. Well, when Obama makes a mistake, it's highlighted too. And since the coverage is more negative than positive, although I will say this, for the first 3 months that he was running, Obama got the best press of all the candidates. Subsequently, he has not. But still, his press is more positive than Mrs. Clinton's is. At any rate, Mrs. Clinton has a lead, and Obama and Edwards and all the other ones are fighting to become the ABC candidate, and they're trying to do that in those early states. And they have, through the South Carolina primary, which is on January 29th, to establish themselves. If they divide the votes and she's still in the running, on February 5th, they're going to be probably overwhelmed unless she makes a critical error. And so far, at least, she's run, with the possible exception of the debate two times ago, an errorless campaign. Every statement that comes out of her mouth seems to have been pre-tested before 5 or 6 focus groups and supported by a lot of poll data, and she has run a highly effective scripted campaign. She's also aided by the fact that she's a woman. Women are disproportionately Democratic, and women come out to vote in larger numbers than do men for primaries and general election. And being a woman this time around will help rather than hurt Mrs. Clinton if she is the Democratic nominee. There is much less enthusiasm and no consensus Republican candidate at the moment, although Giuliani leads by about 13% in the polls over Senator McCain, Fred Thompson, and Mitt Romney. Giuliani is not well known, and his positions on social issues do not comport with those of the Christian coalition base in the Republican Party. Romney has not been able to move out of single digits, despite the fact that he has spent the most money on advertising. He's run half the ads. And despite the fact that his campaign has brought in $62 million $62.5 million through September 30th, of which $18.5 million he lent his own campaign. He's the only candidate so far that has dug into his own pocket. You recall 4 years ago when his campaign was floundering, John Kerry mortgaged one of their 12 houses or so for $6.4 million and put that into his campaign. And then once he won the nomination, he was able to pay off and get the house back. So we're not going to take a collection for him at this time. So we'll see. The one candidate who seems to be moving now among the conservative social Republicans is Mike Huckabee, the governor of Arkansas. The problem that Huckabee has is, one, he has very little money. As of September 30th, he only had $700,000 in the bank, so you can't run much ads with $700,000. And the second, that I was telling some people, Mike Huckabee has become a health nut. He was 100 pounds heavier, a rather robust First Baptist minister and then governor of Arkansas. And he went on a diet and he lost 100 pounds. And us fat people, me included, hate him for doing that because we're unable to do it. So he will lose the fat vote in the general election. I'm convinced of that if he gets the Republican nomination. All right, now let's look at the environment for the general election. The issues, you ask people what's the most important issue today, 38% say Iraq. And between 55 and 65% of those people think it was a mistake to go in and they want out. So that's an issue that favors the Democrats in the presidential election if the war persists, regardless of whether or not the number of IEDs has declined, as it seemed to in Iraq right now. We're tired of being there. We've lost 3,800 people. We have spent between Iraq and Afghanistan $500 billion. $500 billion. The national debt has increased over $1 trillion during the Bush presidency. To pay off the national debt today, which is at $9 trillion, would take $30,000 per person. And we will take a collection after this lecture is over so you can help pay off the national debt. If you want to throw in an extra $30,000 for your brother and sister, that will be fine. The second big issue, 18% mention, is health care. And that issue strongly favors the Democrats. The third big issue at 15% is the economy and jobs. Now, until the recent drop in the stock market a few weeks ago, our economy had been doing pretty well. We had the problem with the subprime mortgage market, but all indicators indicated we had low unemployment, low inflation, and economic growth, which was robust, not extraordinary, but it was robust. So why do people keep talking about the economy? 6 out of 10 people, if you ask them, is the economy excellent, good, fair, or poor, will say fair or poor. 3 out of 4 people, if you ask them the question, is the country going in the right or wrong direction, will say wrong direction. We are in a sour mood right now. We have a migraine from the war in Iraq, and all that works to help the Democratic candidate in the general election if it were held today. Now, who knows what's going to happen? I would argue that there are 2 other potential issues that may occur, both of which will work to the Democrats' advantage. One is if we do fall into a recession and we start having big layoffs, of course that will work to the Democrats' advantage. I'm not an economist, but I think that is a possibility because recessions are cyclical. And the second thing is that, gas prices are going up, not down. And after a while, people get pretty angry at that. I don't think they get necessarily used to it. And so that may work to the Democrats' advantage as well. The second way in which the Democrats are advantaged is in partisan identification. Since 1988, almost 9 out of 10 people who identify with the party have voted for that party's candidate in the election. So party identification matters. Now, in 2000 and in 2004, the parties were at rough parity. It was just about the same number of Democrats as there were as Republicans. That is no longer the case. The unpopularity of the war, the unpopularity of the president, the unpopularity of the previous Republican-controlled Congress has led a number of people who might previously have answered the question, I'm a Republican, to now say, I'm an independent. And we have today, in the latest polls, 25% identifying themselves as Republicans, 33% as independents, and 37% as Democrats. Now, one of the things we know in poli-sci is that there are more people who classify themselves as independents than vote independently. They lean in one direction or another. When you add all of that in, the Democrats have a 14-point lead over the Republicans in terms of partisan affiliation or leaning. That's the biggest lead they've had since Watergate. So that's very significant. And that, too, will probably help the Democratic candidates. And thirdly, in terms of partisan images, they have a more favorable image. Now, you know that the Congress at the moment is very lowly evaluated by the American people. So they don't think that Congress is doing a good job. But if you ask them a question, would you rather have the Democrats or Republicans in charge, more people say the Democrats than the Republicans, even though the Democrats control this Congress, and this Congress is not doing particularly well. In the hypothetical polls in the general election, Hillary Clinton leads Rudolph Giuliani by about 6 to 8 points. Mrs. Clinton is the most popular Democrat. She's also the most negative as far as the Republicans are concerned. There is a huge gender gap at the moment in the pre-election polls. The gender gap resembles the gender gap that we had in '96 and in 2000. At the moment, Mrs. Clinton has a great advantage because of that, and we're talking about a gender gap of somewhere in the neighborhood of 12%. More women will vote for Mrs. Clinton, and only a slight majority of men favor Giuliani. But if Mrs. Clinton is the candidate, it looks like this election will be a mirror image of the election in 2004. Now, the election in 2004 was essentially an up or down vote on President Bush. If you liked him, you voted in favor of it. If you didn't like him, you voted against him. And that meant voting for John Kerry, right? I mean, Kerry was not nominated for his good looks. He was not nominated for his policy positions because people didn't know them. Still don't know him. And he wasn't nominated for his personality. Maybe Teresa voted for him for that, but I don't think anybody else did. He was nominated because they thought he'd run the best campaign and have the best chance against George W. Bush. Now, when I say this election is a mirror image of 2004, if Hillary Clinton runs, I think it's the same thing. I think people will vote for or against Mrs. Clinton, rather than necessarily vote for the Republican candidate, whoever that might be. So she remains a polarizing figure. The Republicans will run the same kind of campaign against her as they ran against Dukakis and Kerry, and they will try to create her into a liberal monster, and which she probably is not at this point. And the Democrats will see her as likely to carry on a more moderate Democratic tradition. And Bill Clinton helps Hillary Clinton more people like having him in the White House, again, than dislike having him in the White House. But here's a very interesting statistic. When you break that down by gender, and you ask men, would you like having Bill Clinton in the White House again or not, 52% say yes, and 29% say no. But when you ask women, they're evenly divided. So I think that's in part because of his philandering, and I think in part it's because if we finally elect a woman, we don't want a man telling her what to do. In terms of the traits of the leading candidates, Giuliani and Mrs. Clinton, they're both viewed as ambitious, as tough, as energetic. They're both viewed more favorably than unfavorably on pretty much the same dimension. For Mrs. Clinton, that's probably a good thing because, she's not a woman that shows her emotion very easily, although she has softened her image by smiling now, which she didn't used to do before, and that's very important. And she laughs, but she laughs at funny times, which aren't very funny for most people. So they're wondering whether the laughter is staged, whether it's natural or unnatural, or whether she sees something that none of us see. We don't know about that, but the smiling has helped her. But clearly she's viewed as a tough candidate, and to use a street expression of all the Democrats, she seems to have the most balls. On the Republican side, Mr. Giuliani is viewed as a tough guy and an energetic guy, but I don't think the electorate knows a lot about his past. And of course, if the Republicans throw a lot of dirt at the Democrats, they're going to throw the dirt right back, and it's going to be a bad mudslinging contest. Romney is hoping that he can win in Iowa, and he's presently ahead in Iowa, and he's doing well in South Carolina. And Romney hopes that by doing well in these small states, that will then bring him enough national attention to make him a serious contender. He's spent more money and more time in Iowa than any of the Republicans. McCain is running hard in New Hampshire. That was the state he beat Bush by 18% in 2000. If he doesn't do well in New Hampshire, I don't see where he's going to go very much. He's just took out a $3 million loan for his campaign. That shows how little money he has at the moment. He's reluctant to accept federal funds, but he may have to. Fred Thompson had much higher approval ratings before he was a candidate. People really thought he'd be a great candidate. Some of these were law and order fanatics who thought he was a great DA. Others were people who were unhappy with the others, and they thought that he would be the answer to that. But as a candidate, he's been a ho-hummer. In other words, he has not really demonstrated the fire and enthusiasm that Republicans wanted, and he hasn't really caught on and hasn't raised all that much money. I might say he's another one. We've never elected a lobbyist as president, and he had become a lobbyist after he left the Senate, as his two children have been. So we'll have to see where this goes, but I think the prospects at the moment are that Mrs. Clinton will win the Democratic nomination. I'm less clear about the Republican nomination, but Giuliani, with a lot of money and name recognition, and with all those states running on February 5th, the big states, and here's a big difference between the Republicans and Democrats. Republicans allow winner-take-all vote. And so you have winner-take-all states like California. And if Giuliani wins California, I mean, those are a lot of delegates. Giuliani is not doing much in terms of campaigning in Iowa, which he concedes to Romney, in New Hampshire, which he concedes to Romney. He has come down to South Carolina a few times, but Giuliani is counting on being behind until February 5th. Now, the candidate who moves ahead will mount a big PR campaign that says, see, Giuliani can be beaten, but we'll have to see how that goes. Well, I've talked probably for too long, but we have a couple of minutes. I'd be happy to answer any questions or comments or that you may have.
What is the important thing to know for students to know about their effect on the election process? As in, many students feel that their vote doesn't count, so they don't vote. What do students need to know? Well,
if you live in Florida, how could you feel that your vote doesn't count after the 2000 election, which was decided by 537 votes? Your vote does count. Obama is certainly putting a lot of emphasis on getting out a youth vote. And I think it does make a difference because there are a lot of generational issues coming up, Social Security being one of them. If the Social Security system is saved, it's going to be through your tax dollars. If the Medicare system is saved, it's going to be in part through your tax dollars. If the Pell Grants and education grants are continued, you have an interest in that. So I think there should be a lot of student interest. It's your country. You're going to live there longer than most of us, and you might as well have a voice. It seems to me that some of the candidates, such as Obama, are addressing student concerns, but I think votes really do count, and I don't think this is an election that you can take for granted. Now, saying all that, I think the incentive for voting in the Florida primary is much lower because of the penalties both parties have imposed on the state for holding their primary too early.
So what is your personal opinion about Ron Paul's chances?
What's my personal opinion about Ron Paul's chances? Well, he's surprised a lot of people by the amount of money he's raised. It's very interesting to note that the vast majority of that money has come from men, white men. His views are the views of people who are frustrated and angry with government. But his views don't represent mainstream American views. He hasn't moved discernibly in the polls. And his campaign has been more effective raising money than increasing his visibility. So I don't see him as a viable candidate for president or vice president on the Republican ticket.
Do you think that the problem might lie with the media not giving him the attention? Because I really don't think...
Well, usually when a candidate stands out and is different, they get attention because the media likes to provide a form of entertainment. But attention relates to the media's perception of electability. And we know the candidates who have received the most attention are those who have raised the most money and are deemed most electable. That's been the case ever since I started studying. So it's very hard to come from behind. That's why I mentioned Huckabee, because he's the only candidate who seems to be moving at all in the Republican polls. So the media does not give equal coverage to all the candidates, and it never has. It gives more coverage to candidates who they think have a reasonable chance of winning. He's gotten some attention. He's gotten most attention from bloggers, but I don't see him going anywhere. And he's 70 years old.
Florida, the I-4 corridor, irrespective of the delegates that it does generate, the primary has been moved up by the Republicans here. And it seems that that will have either a lot of recognition. Now, if Huckabee is a Southern Baptist or a Baptist, it seems like the Baptist vote, the Southern Baptist vote, is very, very powerful in the I-4 corridor. And if that voting bloc pushes him over, what effect do you think it's going to have?
Well, Florida is a critical state in the general election, and that's why it's a shame that the candidates can't campaign here. Both parties have prevented that. if there was an unusually large vote for one candidate, that would help that candidate, but for it to help the Republicans in the general election, that candidate has to be the Republican nominee, and the odds are that Huckabee, best he could do, would be vice president. But we'll have to see. We don't know. Hey, thank you all. Thank you for staying.